So thanks for joining us. So we'll get right into it. So let's rewind back to 95. This is when you started Datum Telegraphic. But I think you need to tell people what Datum Telegraphic is, because even I was reading about it, and I didn't know what it was.
Well, we were taking advantage of the whole move to third-generation cellular. Prior to 1995, there was more of the 2G cellular, or prior to actually 2000, the 2G cellular, and there was just a proliferation of wanting to use data over cellular. People didn't have phones back then, and so we had taken advantage of a trend where the changes in some of the digital signal processing speeds and analog devices, A to D converters and things like that, we could provide linearity in base stations. So we sold a chip or a high-speed digital signal processing component that sat on the RF module of a base station, which is the radio relay between a handset and a switch. And so we were selling to big companies. Like back then, it was really, now we talk about viral marketing. There wasn't viral marketing there. There was 5 or 6 big base station companies in the world. There was Ericsson, Nokia, Motorola, Lucent, and a Canadian company called Nortel, you may or may not have heard of, and then Siemens would have been the other one. And those were the 6 big companies. And so we sold directly to those companies. And what made our success, the company, was that we actually signed contracts with Ericsson, Nokia, and Motorola. So they had signed contracts with us. And it kind of goes to that whole point where we came to a point where we needed to, we were a high-speed digital signal processing software company. And everybody wanted us to provide a turnkey solution, put it to chip. But we weren't an IC company, chip company. So we either needed to hire a whole number of people that were really chip engineers and change our business, and we needed to raise something like $50 million, like an inordinate amount of capital. And it just came to that pivot point where we said, do we raise a lot of money? And we had bootstrapped a lot of the business, so we had raised very, very little money. And so we thought, or do we just exit? And we created a bit of a bidding contest, and a couple of companies, including PMC and Texas Instruments and Nokia, were interested in buying us. And ultimately, that drives valuation, and we were able to sell for a high valuation. And the investors made 40 times their money, so everyone was happy.
So again, this is back when you said people didn't have cell phones. In 95, I'm like,
well, yeah, back in 95.
I guess it's early days.
No, actually, the honest truth is, this is my partner, Andy Wright, and I, back in 1995, we didn't get our first phone until about 1997 or 1998. And our investors, when they found out that we were selling into the cellular market, we didn't own cell phones, were rather annoyed, to say the least. So, no, we didn't. I got my first cell phone in probably about 1997 or 98, portable cell phone.
So on that note, though, how do you decide to go into basically hardware or not hardware? How do you decide to go into that business, though? It's not like, I have an idea for an app and I'm just going to code it. Like, seems pretty complex, and you said capital intensive potentially, right?
It was. You have to look back at the times. Things have changed now. Like, I certainly wouldn't encourage people to go into hardware now, or to go into companies wouldn't require that kind of capital. But back then, as you're moving to the dot-com bubble, people were interested in innovation. People were paying for innovation. And so no one cared about profitability at that point. They were just talked about innovation. Understand that dot-com came up to year 2000, things changed. So back then, people liked hardware side. So there was a company called Broadcom, which sold for $400 million not Broadcom, Hot House. It sold to Broadcom for $400 million just before we did. I know the guys very well. It was the same thing. They were doing hardware business. So you have to look at it from a different angle. Back in the 1990s, I think hardware was the way to go, because innovation is imperative. And direct selling was what was being done. So you're 20 years later, it's a little bit, you're looking at it from a different lens.
So with Ben and Alex, they were talking about co-founders. How does that work? Did you have co-founders? How did people come together and create something like that?
Yeah, well,
who did you work with?
Yeah, I worked with a guy named Andy Wright, who's a brilliant engineer. So I was the CEO and ran more the business financing element. Andy was the technical brilliance behind the business. We had a fortuitous process, because we started we both worked for a company called NPR Teltech back in the early 90s, and it was owned by BC Tel before it became TELUS, and it was really the R&D arm for BC Tel, and the company was being dissolved and being sold off into different parts. It was a 500-person company here in Vancouver, and so when it was being sold off, we said we didn't want to be part of that sell-off. So we hired what we thought were the top engineers. So we started with a very strong team right from the onset. And we were experts in that whole data over cellular business. So kind of similar to what Sierra Wireless was doing at the time. Back now they're a large public company. We were doing something in that same vein.
Mm-hmm. And so before you were doing Datum Telegraphic, again, I sort of mentioned you were at IBM, you were at Apple, and then you said NPR Teltech. What did you learn from those companies that helped with your own venture? And it looks like pretty far into your career you decided to start a company. So any reason for that? Did you ever plan to be an entrepreneur?
No,
or did you learn a lot of those big companies? Do you apply that?
No, I didn't plan to be. I think what I learned from it, back then it was harder to start a company. It was harder to raise capital, and so you needed a little bit more experience. So people in their 20s would have been maybe a little premature, where now it's starting in your 20s is not a problem. We were in our 30s at the time. I think from IBM and Apple I learned how to sell, how to engage with a customer and work with a customer. And then for me, I got kind of bored of the computing industry and wanted to reinvest in myself. So I took, in some ways, a step backwards in part of pay to work for NPR, but just immersed myself into telecommunications. So I thought that's where things were moving. So to me, I was always looking ahead at where the trends were, and I thought telecommunications was the trend back in the 90s, and I followed that trend. And then, Ben made the same comment about a partnership. I wouldn't start a company or advocate anyone starting a company without a partner. There's that comment, I think it was the Harvard Business Review talked about the success. It was two people founders by far were the greatest level of success, three being the next. And then if you get more than three, it becomes a little bit too many people in the kitchen. And one is it's just not enough. You need to have a partner. And someone who, in our case, Andy was the technical brilliance and I was more the business side, and we complemented each other. So it wasn't like a pissing contest. We're trying to see, who could do it better. We had our own sandboxes. And in some ways, I don't think he ever reported to me. I kind of looked upon it, even though I was the CEO, he had his division, I had my division.
I was going to say, how do you find a good founder, right? Like, how do you basically say, no, this isn't going to work? Obviously, you want somebody who's going to call you out and disagree with you, and you want unique perspectives, but I'm sure your work with companies now, right, you've seen where some of these partnerships don't work out, right? So how do you know it's not going to work out?
Yeah, I think you need to spend a lot of time. We probably spent about a year talking to each other about that. Ben made that comment about stakeholders being in alignment, and that is an absolute imperative. I think that if you're starting a company, making sure your founder's in alignment with who you are, all your investors are in alignment with what you want to do, your team's in alignment, your board's in alignment, because you just have one dissident and it becomes a problem. So I was very, very fortunate. I had a tremendous board and investors, and it was always smooth sailing, and we never argued. We just were always focused on the end goal. So, and in my other businesses, I've always really focused on working environment. And it's the same thing when I don't serve on boards unless people, there's an understanding of what our goals are. And our goals are, at the end of the day, we want everyone to make money. The founder should make money. The shareholder, the employees should make money. The option holders should make money. So I would never invest or be on a company that the employees didn't get options. And the investor should make money. And if not all three people are three constituents making money and working for the same cause, then I think it's problematic.
So I think Ben took about 2 years off before he started Rocket Place's new shop. How long did you take after you sold Datum Telegraphic before you were working on something new, or you had a niche?
Well, I ran their wireless division for a couple of years, so that was, I stayed on. I had a bit of a commitment to stay on.
PMC Sierra.
Yeah, I had a commitment to stay on for 2 years. I was there for about 2.5 years. Then I started another business. I guess it was a games company in about 2005, which we had a quick exit. But everyone made money. And then I kind of got into the stage where I wasn't interested in starting a business, but I was investing in companies. And what happens is when companies have some missteps, you kind of end up taking on a more active role. So I often become chairman of the board of companies because you usually want an independent chair as opposed to the chair of a venture firm. And there's been companies where you've had to make some changes and you had to step in. So I've had to step in a couple of times and roll up my sleeves and get involved in the company. Or, sometimes you have to let a CEO go and you have to bring on a different CEO. So you step in during that period of time. So I've been involved in helping resurrect some companies and help align them for success. And ultimately, not necessarily by design, but I've been involved with a lot of M&A transactions.
Yeah. So again, based on your own experience, and then also based off of you've been chairman of the board at multiple companies or executive chair, right? I think Recon, Quick Mobile, There's some other ones, right?
Partnerpedia.
Partnerpedia.
Yeah. I wasn't the executive chair at Quick Mobile, but yes, I was the chair there.
And they were acquired by
Yes.
CVent.
CVent, yeah, that was the last one,
one,
yeah.
right? So where are the biggest hiccups for whenever you've stepped in? What is the reason that a founder is struggling?
I mean, I'm not saying always say that the founder was struggling. Sometimes there's issues where the investors have a different view of what wants to be done than what the founder does. So you're trying to appeasement. So I feel like sometimes I'm a bit of a traffic cop. I think my role has been much more of a pragmatic thinker. As entrepreneurs, we're always blue sky, but I think entrepreneurs who are so head in the clouds, hoping for the best things, sometimes don't take that pragmatic view. I have that expression that it was actually Andy Grove from Intel said, "Only the paranoid survive." And I think that there's a value in being a little bit nervous and trying to see what could go wrong. If you have this view of nothing's going to go wrong, I think you fail to see the obstacles.
What advantages do you think founders today have than back when you were starting a company in '95?
Well, I think the companies don't need as much capital to get going. The term viral marketing didn't exist. Now it does exist. So your ability to get to a customer is much easier. There's much more tools available towards doing it. But it's just not as capital intensive. I think that's probably the key element to that you can be creative in your way to get to customers. But I think the other challenges still exist, but it's a lower barrier in the sense of amount of money needed to get started.
When you built Datum, were you fully based here?
Yeah.
So Ben was talking about he's got some people in San Fran, he's building his engineering team here. Have you worked with companies where they have their teams spread out, and what have been the pitfalls or benefits? What have you seen?
No, I think, absolutely. In the case of the one business I did, which was the games company Flyover, we had a development arm in Shanghai. And we thought we were pretty clever in setting up a Shanghai office. And that turned out to be being problematic. And part of it was because neither one of us understood the Chinese marketplace. We weren't indigenous to it. And we wanted to have our art assets there because we were going to sell our product into the Chinese market. So we made a lot of mistakes. But I mean, I'm not currently, but I was the chair of a company called Login Radius here in town, which is doing great, and they just raised, $17 million. And so the board composition changed, and I stepped off the board. But the two gentlemen are from India. And so they have offices spread out through like Jaipur and Hyderabad, but they understand, they're indigenous to that culture. And so they have done a tremendous job of doing that, and it's much lower cost basis. So I'm actually a big believer in outsourcing and into outside jurisdictions, but I think you need to understand what you're getting into.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I was just looking at our time. So right now, most of your time is advising and angel investing. Or no?
Yeah, that's all I do right now, yeah.
Yep. So let's say I
try to travel a little bit.
Yeah. Let's say there's some new entrepreneurs here and they're looking for advice on how do I get an intro to maybe you, but also just any angel investor. What sort of work do you want to see before you'll take a meeting with someone? What should someone who's looking to raise angel investment, what should they have prepared already? Is an idea sufficient, or are you looking at their background? What are you looking at?
Yeah, I mean, everyone looks at things differently, so I can only speak for myself. I'm probably not interested as much in pre-revenue companies. I think the view is that, the whole view, if you invest in a pre-revenue company, you get it at a low valuation. Well, I'd rather spend a little bit more money, pay at a higher valuation, and de-risk the component. And so I want to understand that product market fit. So the further you're on to the revenue, the more you're interested in it. Even if I'm paying a little bit more, I would rather do that. As an investor, I like to syndicate with people I know. I don't want to be the only deep pocket investor around the table. It's kind of like, when you play poker or anything like that, and you look around the table, you wonder who the sucker is. It's you. And so I don't want to be the only deep pocket. So I like to invest with people I know. Sometimes I like to invest alongside venture institutions, like let's say Founders Fund, and they say they put in $1 million, and I say, okay, they're already into it. They're going to put some governance alongside it. I'll go along 100,000 alongside that. So sometimes I go along that manner. As far as I'm fairly open to meeting with people, to giving them advice. Like I'll sit down and have a coffee with someone if they want some thoughts on things. I think always the biggest fear is that people come into a meeting wanting you to invest in the company, and that's their whole reason for meeting you. And so I kind of couch it and say, look, I'm happy to sit down and chat and give some advice, but if your whole goal is to get my money, and you use a euphemism to say we want your advice and it's just we want your money, I'm afraid that it might be disappointing because, I meet with a lot of companies before I actually invest in it. But and I think the other key is I just don't want to invest. I think the fear is if you invest $100,000 alongside a $500,000 round, and there's 5 people doing $100,000, and that's not enough capital to take it going, you're afraid that in 6 months they're going to come back to you and say, okay, we're running out of money, you need to put another $100,000, and it's like this continued funnel. So I'm a little bit mindful of that. You want to cap how much you end up putting into it. I just don't want to be continuing to fund that money going forward.
And so with your second or third businesses, were you using your own money or were you going out and raising?
A little of both. I mean, everybody, like my first business, I had no money. I think we put in about $20,000 each, but that was really tapping us. But yeah, everybody wants you to have some skin in the game. I think it all comes down to how much you have. So yeah, certainly the expectation, if I'm starting a company right now, that I'd be putting in a sizable amount of money. But certainly if you don't have a lot of money, then it's not expected. But yeah, the further along you go, yes, the expectation is you're putting a lot more money into it.
Mm-hmm. Let's jump back to again, you building your companies. Can you talk about some of the first hires you ever made? So first hire for Datum or first hire for some of these other ones?
Yeah, in our case, I always hired people I knew. So my first hires were people I had worked with before. And they were just really technical expertise. I felt I brought together finance, I brought together sales, I brought together marketing. That was the skills that I brought into it. My partners would always bring in the technical chops. So we were just looking for engineers in those particular market spaces. And I agreed with what Ben said. The product market element I felt needed to be owned by the founders at the onset. So it was really just looking for engineering talent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a story about a very bad hire you made?
I don't know if I have, actually. It's funny enough. I would say one thing is that, at Datum, the times were changed then. People didn't change jobs as much, and everyone saw our business as a growth. In 5 years of the company, not one person ever quit our company, and we never fired a single person. And so the interesting thing about it is, I know part of the reason why people didn't quit was because they had options and the business was growing at a fairly rapid rate and they didn't want to lose their options because they lost their options, they quit. But I would say that there was at times I felt we should have fired some people. We never did because we didn't want to ruin our perfect record. So maybe that's more of a stupidity component, but we were more concerned about plus we wanted to keep this, we wanted to have an image that we were a company that cared about our employees. And we felt if we fired someone, that showed that you didn't care about their employees. So, but maybe we took that too far.
So besides the options, what other reasons do you think people stayed?
Oh, I think they enjoyed the culture. I think they enjoyed the environment. I think we provided a fun environment for people. People worked really hard, but we did lots of good activities. We were very transparent with our employees. We had lots of town halls, talked about what the type of things that we were doing. So I think there was lots of things to the culture. But times have changed now. People now, companies don't have loyalty employees, and employees aren't as loyal to companies. So it's a different culture. Like 20 years ago, things were different.
Well, I was going to say,
sounding very old, don't I?
So I visit a lot of startups in town, and you go in, and the walls got all their values, right? And you walk around, and everything's about the culture and the values. Did you guys have that, or was that not necessary? And do you think companies or CEOs are overemphasizing that now?
No, I won't go as far as saying that. We didn't write down values. We didn't have them. We didn't even have a human resources department, which I think you do. Think that now you need to have a human resources department. I think we just lived it out. I think it was just part of who we are. I mean, if you asked our employees, they'd like that. Now, I couldn't do that with some of the companies I've stepped into where the culture was different. I didn't have the ability to start the culture. This is when you start a business, you can create that culture right from the onset. You're doing it right from the onset. So I've worked with companies which I've been very frustrated with some of the things that management has done with some of the staff. But you can't change that. It's hard to change a culture. If you start a culture right, you can continue on with a good culture. But it's hard to walk in there and tell you how I think you should do things differently and change that whole culture.
I don't know how much time I have left because I'm not facing where the... 5, but that includes questions. Yes, so we need to get to questions. Do we have any questions then?
Yeah, I don't know if there's guys you want.
Oh, there's a couple here.
Hi. Do you see any parallels between the tech bubble that existed 20 years ago and the crash that happened with what's going on now in Silicon Valley?
No, I don't know if I think that parallel. I'm actually quite bullish on things. So I'm probably, maybe I'm as an entrepreneur, I'm not that bearish. I'm not even bearish on the market right now. I think things are going to continue to prosper, and I think the technology sector is going to do great. So, you might see a moderate slip, but I think that wages are going to go up and capital will increase, and technology will be a bigger part of our life. So I'm really quite bullish and optimistic about the prospects. And I think that Vancouver is poised for tremendous success. We've never had more solid, strong companies. And we're seeing big new companies, which unfortunately, like the Amazons and Apples and Facebooks, they come in, I think they hurt the ecosystem of the small company, but they help the general economy. So it depends on how you look at things.
So you spoke about getting involved in companies in advisory capacity. Do you get a lot of those types of requests, so strictly advisory in nature? And how do you think about selecting which companies you get involved with?
Well, I guess in advice, when somebody wants me to advise, they always want my money first. So I think that's, I'm not sure. I've never had anyone say to me, we just want your advice from a company. Advice is for free. I will sit and have coffee with someone and give them some advice to a point. I'm not interested in being on a board just for, optics sake. I'm looking at, something where I feel there's a good positive fit. So it's just, I like the people, I understand it, and I feel I can help them. And I guess I'm not sure what else to say.
So you mentioned that things were different in hardware engineering back in 1995, and they're way different right now. I'm a IC design engineer right now. I'm a very fresh engineer, and I've been working in Taiwan for 2 years, and I'm fresh off the boat right now here in Canada. So I was just wondering, when we talk about Silicon Valley, we talk about Taiwan. People literally breathe in and breathe out all about IC design and hardware. How are things over here today in Canada? Or would you ever invest in some new startup, hardware startup, or IC design startup in Canada?
The honest answer is no, because the capital requirement is too great. If there's one downside being in Canada, in Vancouver, is a lot of the companies are underfunded. So it's hard. The Clios are outliers. No, there's just too much money to be made. To be spent on those companies. I think as an investor, I can get a better return on a company where you start off with a couple $1 million and there's an exit for $50 million or something along that line. So I personally stay away from that type of hardware product. If I can just bring one question, I was going to say one thing I just didn't get mentioned, and I think it's important. When people talk about companies that success is based on timing. I look at a company like, many of the companies that I've sold that have been involved and they've, had a great outcome. And everyone says, man, that's fantastic. But, had been it 6 months later or a year later, the company might have been belly up. We know a lot of companies in town. I'm not going to name the companies, but we know a lot of companies in town that have had an inflection point and now they're on a bit of a downward cycle. And had they sold at that inflection point, we'd have said massive success. But they didn't sell, and now there's that downward cycle. And I think that when you're running a business, you have to look at what that inflection point is. And at some point, you're going to say, either I need to raise a lot of capital or I need to sell that business. And that might drive your success level. So I would say I'm being fortunate because I've had that right timing. But I also want to say that had I waited a little while longer, the companies could have imploded. So I wouldn't say, like Ben talked about his business, what was the right timing? He thinks the timing you talked to him that it would have been a year later, but timing is everything.
Great. Any other questions? I've got one, if no one else. Oh.
What do you think the 5G is going to do to your industry? Is it important, or you thinking about investing, or you think it can be ignored?
Yeah, the whole 5G element, in my mind, 5G is just the advent of, of IoT. We're going to get to a point where, like, I look at my house right now. I think I probably have 12, 15 devices that are connected to the network. It's just an inordinate number of devices, and you don't actually, well, probably more than that. But it's just you don't realize how many devices you got hooked to the network. So we're not far off to have 50 or 100 billion devices that will be connected to the network. So I think 5G is huge. I'm not sure if it's a play in the hardware side, like or the infrastructure side, but I think analytics and sensors alongside that, yeah, I personally think it's a big market opportunity.
Great. Well, I've got one more question then. So you obviously advise a lot of startups. You're an angel investor. You've been chair of these boards. What is the thing that you are constantly repeating to entrepreneurs? Piece of advice you feel like you're just always repeating.
Yeah, probably the one I say the most is only the paranoid survive, just because I think entrepreneurs become, they let their optimism get ahead of themselves. I think that, I think people raise too little money. And so I often say, and that kind of goes to that optimistic side, raising money takes a lot of time. And you're trying to raise $500,000, I think, I always say to them, should you maybe raise $1.5 million or $1 million? And because you waste too much time. And they all think that the valuation is going to go up, and it doesn't necessarily happen. So I try to temper their enthusiasm. I think that's probably what I think, which sometimes people see it as being a bit of a downer. But I'm afraid that I like optimism, and I like enthusiasm, and I love this dreaming big, but I want there to be a pragmatic view of things.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Laurie. Super insightful. Can we give him a round of applause?